All right. Here we're going to talk about utilitarianism. And this is part one. Here we're going to get an overview of the theory itself. This lecture assumes that you have listened to the ethical theory lecture and to the arguments and ethics lectures so that you understand why we need theory. And also that you have listened to all of the introductory video lectures. It also assumes that you have done the assigned reading on utilitarianism. Over to the left here, you can see an actual picture of John Stuart Mill, who said, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." Note that if anybody says in proportion, this is not like a light switch, it's on or it's off. It's more like a dimmer switch, right? You've got more light, you've got less light. So some actions are going to be better than others, even though they're not actively wrong relative to whatever's happening today. So some actions will be better, but not actually the best action. So the best action is the one that promotes happiness the most. The worst action is the one that promotes the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. Now, we're going to see a bit more about this as we go on, but keep this in mind. This is what is often called the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility. Now, utilitarianism is a specific form of what's called consequentialism. Consequentialism is a larger theory of right action, which says, it's a sort of group of theories. And all consequentialist theories say, the way you tell whether an action is right is by looking at its consequences. Well, this form was developed by Jeremy Bentham and then by John Stuart Mill. So what we're going to be looking at here is which consequences John Stuart Mill thought were the right kinds of consequences to look at to evaluate whether an action was right or wrong. You could do this differently, right? There are consequentialists who use a kind of capitalist ethics, and what they look for there is how the profit is best made in order to create the most jobs and so forth, right? But what we're going to be looking at here is a kind of different notion of what the right outcome measures would be. So, quick question, just to test your understanding. How do consequentialist theories determine what is right and wrong? By looking at the actions themselves, or at the end or consequence of the action? If you answered end or consequence of the action, you are correct. Consequentialists are not concerned with your intentions. You might have had the best intentions, but if your intentions resulted in a great deal of harm, they will be pretty upset with your action and your choice. So what distinguishes utilitarianism from other consequentialist theories is what it judges to be morally desirable good consequences and what it judges to be morally desirable bad consequences. And that has to do with the end or goal in question. So here's what John Stuart Mill said. This is a little more than what's in your text. He said, all action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. As man's sentiments, both in favor and aversion, are greatly influenced by what they suppose to be the effects of things upon their happiness, the principle of utility, or as Bentham latterly called it, the greatest happiness principle, has had a large share in forming the moral doctrines. Happiness is a most material and even predominant consideration in many of the details of morals. So Mill here is starting to lay out the reasons that he thinks we should look at happiness as the good kind of consequence, and its absence as the bad kind of consequence, right? All of actions we tend to judge based on their consequences, he argues, and the consequence that matters the most to people is happiness, right? The consequence that matters the most to people is happiness. Therefore, what we should be looking at is how actions affect the balance of happiness and suffering. So Vaughan gives a version of the greatest happiness principle in his reading on John Stuart Mill. Go to that reading and see if you can find it, right? Now, remember, this reading starts on page 35 and goes through page 37. So pause this, see if you can find where Vaughan gives the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle. Right, you're right, it's on page 35, right in the middle. As Mill put it, Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Privation means removal of or loss of. So actions which have positive utility and are thus right actions will be increasing happiness and decreasing suffering. But then the next question is this for individuals or for communities? And for the answer to this, you're going to turn over to page 36 and look at the top of the left-hand column. Like all forms of utilitarianism, the classic formulation demands a strong sense of impartiality. You remember our discussion of impartiality from the lecture on ethical theories. When promoting happiness, we must not only take into account the happiness of everyone affected, but also give everyone's needs or interests equal weight. Mill explains, the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. Right? So it doesn't matter whether you're choosing between family members or distant strangers. Everyone's happiness matters equally to you if you are a utilitarian. This has huge advantages in terms of fairness. It makes it really difficult for you to say, well, I and people like me matter or more than other people who I don't know or don't see. Right? This would go a long way towards valuing certain kinds of people who we've often disvalued even more. People with certain kinds of disabilities, or people of certain kinds of races, or, for instance, women versus men. All of their happiness and suffering would be of equal value. Right? And so an action that increased happiness for 90% of the people a great deal, but decreased it slightly for 10% of the people would be totally acceptable under utilitarianism and might indeed be the best way to do it, unless there were a way to increase happiness without decreasing it at all for anyone. So when we look at this question, actions which have positive utility and are thus right actions do what? For individuals or communities, your answer should be actions which have positive utility and are thus right actions increase the sum total of happiness and decrease the sum total of suffering for communities, for everyone affected, not just for the individuals who are contemplating the action. Actions which have negative utility and are thus wrong actions are therefore going to be decreasing happiness, increasing suffering, again, for everyone affected, not just for individuals. So in Mill's original argument in his book Utilitarianism, he goes to great pains to counter possible objections to his opinion. He actually raises them. He says, a lot of people think that what I'm talking about is what previous versions of this theory have talked about, namely hedonism, where we're all going to be pursuing raw pleasure and playing in the sun, all right? He says, no, that's not right. Utility is not judging everything by pure pleasure in its grossest form. It's not hedonism. So why is happiness not just mere physical pleasure or hedonism? Because Mill makes a distinction that previous utilitarians did not make as effectively. He says there is a quality, not just quantity, of pleasure, and some pleasures are more valuable than others. All right. He says, a beast's pleasures do not satisfy human beings' conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. So pause right now and see if you can think of some pleasures because of your intellectual capacities that you have access to that raccoons do not. All right, pause and think. Okay, great. So I'm not sure what you came up with, but when I think about this, I think about things like the ability to enjoy a turn of phrase in poetry, or the ability to enjoy the way that rhythm builds in dance music, right, and club music. The ability to really reflect on large ecological systems and how kind of mind-blowingly cool they are, you know. The ability to have aesthetic appreciation that, as far as we know, raccoons are not capable of. The ability to love in a way that, as far as we know, raccoons are not capable of. Right? The ability to enjoy a good conversation with friends, or to distinguish between different kinds of foods or beer and say, ah, this is my favorite. Oh, there's too much chili in this one. Oh, I would not put that much hot sauce on next time. Or I would put more on, right? Those are all kinds of higher faculties. You can probably come up with some of your own that are particular to you. Now, imagine for a second that I had Harry Potter style magic and I could turn you into an animal. You would lose these higher faculties. Let's say that I'm going to turn you into a raccoon. I'm not just going to turn you into any raccoon. I'm going to turn you into a happy raccoon. All right? Look at all these, oh, that raccoon looks kind of angry. But look at all these other happy raccoons, you know, they're doing stuff, they're getting food, they're playing. Those are not raccoons, those are lemurs. And what we have here is the idea that raccoons, maybe they wear hats, but, you know, they're playing, they're having social time with each other, they're doing other raccoon things. You know, you could be this raccoon. You could be this raccoon. You could be deliriously happy washing your hands, playing in the water, climbing trees, opening trash cans, getting at all the human garbage, eating anything you liked. Now, would you trade your current life to be that raccoon? It's a perfect raccoon life. I'll even give you the total raccoon lifespan with a promise of no disease, and you will never be eaten by a predator. Okay? So, what if I offer you that? Would you take it? Well, Mill thinks that you wouldn't, right? When once made conscious of these faculties, he said, humans do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. He says, of two kinds of pleasures, ask the person who knows both which he or she prefers. The one most prefers the best. He says, those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. So he thinks that as long as you know both what it's like to have basic physical animal-like pleasures and what it's like to have intellectual pleasures, if somebody says, do you want to trade one for the other? He says, nobody who knows both would give up the intellectual pleasures. He says, no intelligent human would consent to be a fool, even if the fool is better satisfied with his lot. No instructed person would be an ignoramus, even if the dunce is better satisfied with his lot. No person of feeling or conscience would be selfish or base, even if the rascal is better satisfied with his lot. So here's a little more on qualities, not just quantities, of pleasure and happiness. And this is something that Vaughan actually pulls out and puts on the bottom of page 35 in your text. Right? It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Can we agree this dude does not look too happy and this pig looks absolutely delighted to be swimming in mud? Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the equation. All right, so he has other ways of ranking pleasures and suffering, and he says injury to health is worse than a loss of luxury. But he brings in some other things as well. He says the greatest sources of physical and mental suffering are indigence, disease, and the unkindness, worthlessness, or premature loss of objects of affection. All right, pause this and go look up what indigence means. All right, so you've seen that indigence roughly means poverty, lack of resources, etc. Maybe homelessness as well. So which of these can healthcare obviously deal with? Pause and think about this for a minute. All right, good. I think you probably figured out healthcare can obviously deal with disease. But what about these other things? Can healthcare prevent the physical and mental suffering of indigence, of poverty? Can it prevent the unkindless worthlessness or premature loss of objects of affection? An object of affection is someone to whom your affection is directed. So my husband, my son, my friends, etc., my parents. Well, it seems healthcare could probably deal with premature loss of objects of affection. In the 1800s, parents who had 6 kids were likely to see at least 3 of them die before they reached adulthood. The average rate of childhood death before reaching adulthood was 50% in the 1800s and previously, due to lack of basic public health measures. Right? Not necessarily high-tech medicine, but things like vaccines, good plumbing and sanitation. Right? Most of the deaths, more than 50% of the deaths of adults during the Civil War were caused by disease and infection, not actually caused by war injuries. So what we have here is the notion that healthcare can contribute immensely to reducing the greatest sources of physical and mental suffering. Therefore, making healthcare available to everyone could maximize utility, could maximize happiness, and minimize suffering. And this is what utilitarianism really urges us to do, to maximize happiness and minimize suffering, to find the courses of action that will create the greatest amount of happiness, thus the greatest happiness principle, and the least amount of suffering for all concerned. But healthcare could deal with indigence as well. So think for a second, how could healthcare reduce poverty? Well, what happens when you're sick? You can't do what? You can't work, especially if it's a physical job, but even if it's a mental job, right? This is why we have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which tries to protect workers from injury on the job. And the reason that businesses both hate and love that is that it costs them money to make their workplaces safer, but they love it because when their workers, their skilled workers who they have trained for these jobs, are injured on the job, they can't do the work that they were trained to do. And the business has to hire somebody else and start training them. That only works effectively for businesses for a very small number and restricted types of businesses where there's no skill involved or no experience required at all, where you don't get better at the job the longer you do it. Otherwise, businesses have a real interest in making sure that their employees stay healthy. In addition, you can look at larger factors such as which diseases are prevalent. In countries afflicted by malaria, economists estimate that they take at least a 1% hit to their gross domestic product annually. Like the entire country's productivity drops annually over what it would otherwise have been. Well, why? If you're infected by malaria, you're racked with fever, you're in pain, if you're fervid, you can't concentrate or work well, you're weak, you need to sleep a lot, and probably one or more of your family members are also sucked out of the workforce to care for you. So you lose at least 2 people from the workforce for every person who's infected by malaria. And economists say this is really very bad for nations because that 1% of GDP could have been put to education, better roads, a better law enforcement, less corrupt public officials, any number of kinds of things. So it turns out that it looks like healthcare can deal with preventing a lot of these greatest sources of physical and mental suffering, even the unkindness of objects of affection. When are you most unable to be kind and patient with other people in your lives? When you're sick, when you're mentally ill or in chronic pain. There is nothing like trying to be patient with a family member when you hurt all the time from an illness or untreated pain to make you lose your composure and inflict suffering on others. So healthcare well rendered, compassionately delivered, and accessible to as many people as possible really seems like it could address the greatest sources of physical and mental suffering. And this is an argument that many ethicists make when they take on a utilitarian framework. All right. So if you want to see a little more about utilitarianism in action, you can pause now and type these links into your browser. I don't think you'll be able to link directly from them the way I could, but these are really nice little video explanations of philosopher Peter Singer explaining ethics through the lens of utilitarianism. For this one, you can just watch the whole thing. For this one, start at minute 145. And either of these will work pretty well for you. Both will really help to hammer home what this theory means and how it means we have to look at the welfare of people distant from us, not just those we're already connected to. So the next thing you want to do is watch the part 2.